So we've been having these conversations on a Thursday for 3 years nearly, not every week. And yeah, they've varied in terms of their content about how useful or accurate or engaging it was, but that's there. But it feels like now is a good time to kind of draw that to a close and yeah, look more to the future and to think actually about like what do we need from learning and development, what do we need in terms of the support that's available, and yeah, it feels like something a bit more structured than just me talking will be useful. But at the same time, it feels like it's good to have a bit of a coda and just to sort of round off the experience and to say a few words. So there are a few kind of signposts that I want to leave with, which I think pick up on some of the big themes and some of the things that I think continue to be useful to think about. First of which is openness. I think the fact that we landed on the phrase open culture, to describe what we do was not coincidental, because openness is really one of the core defining features of the organisation. Like it's one of the great challenges I think in life that we, in a way that our experience is always just happening to us already. Our perception is always lagging behind. We're always trying to catch up with the stuff that's already happening. We're already angry at or rather, something is already happening to us, and then the meaning that we make of it, that we're sad or angry or energized or whatever it is, always seems to come, afterwards, right? So, what that points to is the way in which we are like a mystery to ourselves. Who actually are we? How do we, we definitely are a person, right? There's something that it's like to be one of each of us as an individual that we think is different from what it's like to be other people. But it's very hard for us to sort of put that into really good words. Like, what is it that makes our sense of humour different to somebody else's, right? You know that your sense of humour is different to other people's. But if I asked you to actually, describe it on like on the back of an index card, your sense of humour, you would probably find that very difficult. And I think the same is true about an organisation, right? The organisation and what makes it special and what captures its essence is also a mystery. It's also something that we're already just experiencing and that we're trying to capture, and we're trying to put models on it, we're trying to put words to it in a way that kind of helps us understand it more, but also that helps us deliberately amplify the parts of it that are most important to us. So hence why I come back to the idea of openness and open culture. When I have conversations with people about our experience of self-management and what has worked well for us and what's been important for us, I always come back to the fact that transparency was the thing that drove our journey from the very start. The idea that everything in the organisation that can be shared is shared. And that still seems very important as a guiding principle. But I think openness goes further than that, right? There's something about the kind of guiding principle of transparency. I mean, it's partly that transparency and openness enables self-management. How can we have a situation where we say, like the amount of power that you can wield here is much, much more significant than you can in other organisations? How can you do that without being safely, without being in possession of full information? So there is a kind of good commercial basis for looking at openness, or but there are other ways that openness is important too. Like I think about we've talked about non-violent communication. Marshall Rosenberg's non-violent communication, and there's an openness in that framework, the way in which it invites you when communicating with other people. Like if we think about non-violent communication as an invitation to get more effective at the way that we share our anger and our frustration with each other. There's an invitation to be more open, to be more vulnerable, to get deeper into what's really going on. Like definitely my experience of MVC when I have seen it work is when you get down to what seems to be the fundamental thing, when you get down to the basic need that's being communicated, suddenly all the angst in the situation seems to fall away. And you're just like, oh, okay, now we're super clear. And I've had this experience as well in other situations, not using MVC, of, you know, like, the deeper that we're willing to go, the more we're willing to unpack what's happening, the more the possibility there is for transformation. You know, this is in holacracy as well, in terms of, like, you know, what do you need? Okay, you're feeling attention, like, okay, you're angry, right? Being angry is just attention. Can we dig into this? Can we be more open? Can we get to a more fundamental layer so that there's a greater opportunity for transformation? So there's something about openness and learning to be more effective in the way that we communicate with each other, learning to go deeper into the communication. You know, that obviously has an implication for feedback. We've talked a lot of feedback in Grantee Fundamentals, and, you know, building a culture of feedback and being more open to both giving and receiving. So I think openness is a key signpost to take away in terms of thinking about, you know, what is the future, what do we want to take away from this, what's useful. And openness feeds into, you know, relationships. Actually, a lot of the stuff that has been the subject matter of these sessions has been about teamwork and about relationships. And there are no relationships in holacracy. You know, it says nothing to you about the interaction between humans, right? It tells you about how roles need to interact with each other, but it doesn't tell you anything about the interaction between humans. But there's something about the way that we choose to interact with each other and the way that we choose to put emphasis on the importance of relationships, you know, that I think is important, and that it's important that we don't lose, and that we find ways to capture this and to structure it and to support it. You know, we've explored, I would say, all of the best ideas that there are out there around this topic. And the challenge going forward with this signpost is to find a way of supporting those more systematically, right? Which is, you know, like part of why is it time to end this session, because it's not enough for me to just talk about them. I mean, it's not enough for me to just talk about them in terms of my own ability to practice them as fully as I want to. So there's something about, you know, like recognizing that's important to me. But I think, you know, the stuff that, like the Patrick Lencioni framework, the 5 dysfunctions of a team framework, is incredibly simple and incredibly powerful. And the thing that sits in that, like if you read the book, it's not very long. It's in the form of a story, and there's even an official summarized version, which is only about sort of 10 pages on a Kindle, which you can get on the Kindle for $1.99, which is, it's nice of them to have done that. But basically, the book makes the case, which is, it's like every other domain of organizations, people have found ways to get competitive advantage out of being better at them than other companies in their sector. And teamwork is the new domain of competitive advantage. That's one of the key messages of the book. So there is this commercial case for seeing the relationships that we have and maintaining effective relationships with each other and getting systematic about maintaining those relationships is a way that we continue to work effectively as an organization. It's not a luxury, it's essential. And there's not, so the 5 dysfunctions model looking at trust and conflict, so the 5 steps are trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, results. The other framework that we've really looked at is the stuff from the Arvinger Institute about the in-the-box, out-of-the-box mentality. And then this idea, for those of you who remember it, or for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the idea that when we are out of the box, when we have an outward mindset, we see the other people around us, the people that we're interacting with, as other people. We project into them hopes and fears and dreams and needs. We make them into people who are as real to us as we are to ourselves. Whereas when we're in the box, in some way we're making other people into just objects in our world. Their problems, their obstacles, they're somehow less to us. And the beauty of that process about asking ourselves, are we in the box, are we out of the box? You know, what techniques are we using to keep ourselves out of the box with each other? You know, that has a really positive effect on your experience of your life, you know, to be in a deeper empathic connection with other people, to be less the slave of your own separated ego. But it also allows us to work together more effectively, because as we start to see other people's concerns and needs as significant and vital as our own, it becomes possible for us to take the sort of final step in the Lencioni framework and, you know, commit to team success, right? Because we see that the needs that are held in the team, even if they're not our own needs, can be balanced against our own, you know, in a meaningful way. So there's a load of stuff there about how both like working systematically on our relationships and having more effective relationships at work, you know, allows us to compete more effectively. There's a commercial reason for it, but there's also a sort of, you know, personal, cultural, you know, sort of fluffy reason for it as well. So that seems like an important signpost for stuff for the future. And alongside our relationships with others, there's also our relationships with ourselves, which is, you know, an equally important component. And you can see how openness feeds into the success of our relationship with others. Openness also feeds into the success of our relationship with ourselves. And the thing about the relationship with ourselves, you know, like check-ins, this is what they exist to do, right? And the thing that check-ins point to is the fact that you always have a context. You know, that you always have a context, and you're not always fully aware of your own context, but getting more aware of your own context, seeing, this is the lens that I'm looking through today. Actually, I'm quite tired today, or I had some bad news, or I just don't feel quite like myself, so I'm going to be seeing everything in a more negative way. You know, so that's the context that I'm bringing to this conversation, right? That can be so useful to you and to other people to understand what's going on for you, to see the lens that you're looking through. But there's a, you know, there's a sort of, what else did I want to say about self-awareness? Oh yeah, and just understanding, like part of self-awareness, I think, is just understanding the fact that you have a perspective. You know, we get so caught up in the reality that we construct that we forget that we've constructed it. It seems really real, right? Because there is an interrelation between the stuff that's out there and the reality that we have, the model that we have of it, you know, because those things are not entirely divorced, it's very easy to get them mixed up and to start to think that the things that we are seeing are the absolute, right? There's a lovely bit in, I'm going to get in a plug for the Sam Harris podcast, but in the latest episode, he's talking to this scientist, and she's saying to him, you know, the whole discipline of science is basically the development of a series of techniques that allow us to get into better dialogue with reality, because actually the way that we perceive reality is often quite misleading, you know, and you can see that we also get really identified with the way that we've perceived it. So we really need strong techniques to shake us from, you know, our conviction that we have access to, you know, how things really work, right? So this idea of experimentation and, you know, sort of scientific technique, like all of cognitive psychology is about this, right? All of cognitive psychology is about the self as scientist, you know, about saying, oh, okay, this is the experience that I'm having, but how do I know this? Is this true? Can I test it? You know, can it be proved or disproved? Is there other evidence that I can get? Are there other ways that I can look at this? And the sort of framework of the third story of seeing, like, you know, I have a reality and you have a reality, but we're both here together as human beings shaping a reality, seeing that we have access to sort of stepping almost to the side of conflicts that we get into when we are more fully accepting of the fact that we have a perspective, when we bring that self-awareness. Understanding that our perspective is limited and there are always going to be things that other people see that we don't see that are significant and true. The rule of 2% truth. Other things around self-awareness that I think are interesting is, you know, there's almost this sort of an idea that, that never quite came to fruition, that had sort of been on the back burner for me in these topics, this idea of like the user manual. You know, everybody kind of has a user manual, right? The more that we know about ourselves, like for instance, quite useful for me as a user manual is, on the big 5 personality traits, I score quite highly, except on emotional stability, or neuroticism, depending on how I want to label it. But if you label it as emotional stability, where I score really low, sort of 24 or something. So, in terms of my user manual, right, that's a really important thing to know about me as part of a team, is that I'm going to be more susceptible to seeing things in a negative light. I'm going to be more critical of my own work. I'm going to be more critical of other people's. And where I'm working with somebody who maybe has a much higher level of emotional stability, then that's potentially going to be an area of conflict for us, because we're going to look at things differently, but it's also an area where we can balance each other out, right? So the more self-awareness that we can bring to our work, the better. And there's one theme that I think just cuts all the way through self-awareness, which is the idea of the shadow. That there are parts of our own experience that we didn't really duck. I mean, it was a lovely demonstration of ducking, wasn't it? But
it was a shadow.
In some ways, there's always bits of ourselves that we don't see clearly, and the bits of ourselves that we don't see clearly, we tend to see really clearly in others. Right? And that just seems to be a really fundamental part of the human experience. Whenever we want to point the finger at somebody else, we're always pointing 3 fingers back at ourselves. That recognizing the stuff that really kind of drives us and activates us in other people is often stuff that points to our own shadow. When we're getting into conflicts that seem really hard to solve, that's often because there's sort of something of ourselves that's coming up in the conflict, and the conflict is pointing to us, like the conflict is giving us an opportunity to see it more clearly. And that's often why they feel so emotionally involving, is because there is this part of us that's being called more into the light that we really don't want to see. And actually that comes back to, I didn't make this another slide in the moment, but just thinking about that, about relationships and self-awareness and the interplay around conflicts. Like, it could almost be a signpost on its own, but I think it sort of fits into these two, is thinking about, conflict resolution, thinking about, one of the things that I have really learned in the time that I've worked here, from myself, that's great, right? I actually managed to teach myself a lesson in these sessions, is if you have a conversation with somebody that just goes badly for reasons that you don't understand, or if there is a topic that just seems really sticky, like every time you come to it, it seems to be difficult and the conversation doesn't really seem to shift, it goes round and round. Or if you find that you just start to have bad faith about somebody else, like you just don't really seem to believe in them anymore, then don't think about it, just use conflict resolution. Don't stop to think, oh, is it a conflict, isn't it? Is this going to be helpful? Don't hesitate, just go and do it, right? Because the conflict resolution process is really simple. It's just about having a conversation with somebody else in the room. But there's something about the fact that it primes you. And we've thought about this a lot. And it's been a heated topic in the past about, should we call it conflict resolution or not? Is it useful to use the word conflict? The reason in the end why I think it probably is useful is that it primes you to see that in addition to the content of whatever it was you were disagreeing about, there's something in the structure in your disagreement, there's something in the way that you're going about having the disagreement, the way you're going about holding that content together that is causing the issue that needs to be looked at. So, and conflict is a great opportunity for, it's obviously one of the ways that we repair and maintain our relationships and deepen them, but it's also a way in which we bring our self-awareness and we increase our self-awareness. And then the final signpost is, self-management. And I call this signpost self-management rather than holacracy deliberately because, it's partly because what this signpost about is the sort of, the finger and the moon analogy, right? Like, don't look at the finger, look at the moon. And the thing about holacracy is that it's a big finger, You know, it's a big foam finger, the big foam finger of Holacracy. But self-management is the moon, right? That's what it's there for. It's a system of self-management. It's designed to structure self-management and make it work on a bigger scale than it would otherwise do, right? We know this, right? That, you know, you can self-manage in small teams without really the need for any structure. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you know, around about that kind of size of team, the team can just get on with it. Maybe there are a few things that you have to enumerate, but basically you can just exchange information informally because you can all, you know, as it were, you know, sit round one table. But as soon as you have a bigger team, you need to do something else. Great, okay. So that's what self-management, that's what Holacracy is there for. It becomes very tempting to want to get good at that and want to, you know, to sort of to excel at that and to lose sight of the fact. It's like, who really wants to get good at playing scales? You know, if you started to think, yeah, well, I really want to be the best at scales, you know, I mean, there's no point in doing that. It's not really very rewarding. But it may be a necessary step to something else. So actually, like, trying to remember, what is this in service of? Because one of the things about Holacracy is that it feels very comprehensive. It feels very big. It feels like it spreads out to fill all the space available. It's quite hungry in that way. And so in some ways, this signpost is, I mean, I think that there are some things that it does extremely effectively, and I think that it has had a really good impact on the organisation. I think it's allowed us to do things that are more sophisticated. I think it allows us to get clarity on difficult situations and to take action much faster. We're in some ways sort of, you know, less like paralysed as an organisation than we used to be, and we're much clearer on kind of the state of the union, I guess. And then there are some things that it seems to stick up more, because actually it's rather like the stuff around relationships, right? Holacracy says nothing about relationships, and it doesn't really provide you with any tools to help you with teamwork and with relationships and with, you know, collaboration. And it's one of the challenges there from one of the signposts is to say, you know, how can we build other stuff alongside it that means that it doesn't, you know, that puts a limit around it and says, look, this is the system that we use for, you know, this, but there's this other stuff that exists in the organisation as well. Like, so that's part of what this signpost is by saying self-management is important, and there need, I think, to be practices around self-management and systems around self-management that make it work. But there is other space that needs to be held as well. Is there anything else that I wanted to say? No, I think that's everything. Any questions or comments? No? Okay, cool. Short and sweet. Or relatively short and sweet. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.